welcome to the SSI Orbit Podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. So my first question for you, Dan, is which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Do you have a good answer to that?
I do not. And everybody has a different perspective, and the chicken and egg problem for each type of situational context, if you wish, has a different answer. All depends on your perspective of the are you the chicken or the egg, right? If we want to take it to identity, I think the real question here is, how do you start an ecosystem? How do you start an environment that is dependent upon or can leverage digital credentials? And I was thinking about this, Matt, when we were going over our questions. So if we let's just take an example: driver's licenses. DMVs take a driver's license and they issue driver's licenses in paper form. Forget digital. And now that seeds the marketplace. It seeds the marketplace with the government ID that can then be used by people to drive, with the privilege to drive. Nothing more. That was the initial intent. But let's step back, chicken and egg. How did the DMV issue the driver's license? What did they depend on? They depended on a birth certificate in most cases, or minimally a birth certificate. Some may be other forms of address identification and for their KYC processing. But in most cases, there was a other form of government identifier, at least here in North America, for the issuance of a driver's license. So chicken and egg, even the birth of the driver's license, right? What came first? You got to go back. Like, there was a dependency. And I think what we're trying to, I think the bigger challenge we're addressing here with digital credentials is that there's this overarching dependency on the government, the issuance of government IDs to seed the marketplace, right? And that takes time. And for those of us who've been in this industry for quite some time and been basically trying to bootstrap the industry, being dependent on and waiting for the government to kickstart it is time consuming. And sometimes we need to figure out how we could help it along, right? And so I think, going back to the analogy of the paper-based driver's license, for digital credentials, what would be the issuance of the credentials that would be dependent upon to bootstrap digital credentials, right? Now, for example, paper driver's license is one of them, right? This leads to the KYC process. Who does KYC processing? And those entities that do KYC processing, could they be the initial issuers of the digital credentials, as opposed to us waiting for the government agencies, the traditional government agencies, to be the issuers of their credentials of origin? That's a phrase that I've used in the past. What do I mean by credentials of origin? So the credential of origin, or the origin of origination, the issuance of origination pertains to the entity that owns the actual credential. So, for example, the DMV owns the issuance of a driver's license. But does that mean that someone could not take that driver's license, vet it, and issue a credential, a digital credential, that doesn't grant you the privilege to drive, but it is basically the issuance of the attestations for all of the data elements that are put on that driver's license, which you can do because you've done a KYC kind of processing? That's the kind of thinking I think we need to visit to help bootstrap our industry, to get us past this hump now, right? We need to get past this notion of we got to get the issuers issuing credentials. Well, what's motivating the issuers? Chicken and egg. If there's no verifiers out there demanding the credentials, they're not going to go in kind of a motivation to do so. Flip it around. If there's nobody issuing credentials, why are the verifiers going to step into the game? Chicken and egg problem. So how do we help, influence or bootstrap that phenomenon?
When you talk about the government agencies being the source of origin for something like driver's license, like one of the key things that they do, and the financial institutions do the same, right? They hold on to databases with personal identifiable information, but there's unique identifiers as well that they all hold on to as well, right? It's like the DMV in the US or ministries of transportation in Canada. The driver's license number, for example, is a unique identifier. If someone that's already going through kind of, let's just say, a KYC process that maybe wants to extend that KYC process and issue something, do they need to have a database that has unique identifiers to come back to?
I personally do not believe so. But then again, it all depends on what are the policies, the processes for your validation of information as an entity. Okay. So I'm going to make this up because I don't know the answer to this, honestly. But let's just say the bank or a bank. Does the bank really need the driver's license number? Or is the driver's license number as you said, an identifier to go obtain through back-end services the information for verification of your address, your name, your date of birth, and so forth, right? So it's really just a mechanism that's built into the credentials that are being used for verification. However, if we move to the digital credential model where transitive trust is now the new way of doing verification, and we avoid subsequent back-end API calls to do verification once we receive something like a driver's license with the driver's license number, do you really need that identifier of the driver's license number? You don't, because through transitive trust, the verifier can instantaneously cryptographically trust the data coming in on the digital credential.
Do you mind breaking down the term transitive trust for the listeners versus how trust is established today in most of the world?
Yeah, so transitive trust, in basic terms, if Dan trusts Matt, he trusts Sam, okay? Along comes John, because John knows Dan. If John knows Dan, could John automatically trust Matt because of the relationship that they built transitively, all right? And that can be proven mathematically, cryptographically, upon receiving digital credentials. And but because of the transitive trust model, if again, it's built on relationships of trust. If you can leverage that, you can avoid doing subsequent backend calls. Now, over time, look, just like any emerging technology, nothing's going to happen overnight, okay? Along came the car, the horse and buggy didn't immediately just die, right? We didn't just stop using horse and buggy. They had to coexist for a period of time. That period depends on the technology. What we're saying here is that there's going to be companies that will start to adopt transitive trust-based verification, but still may additionally do the back-end verification for a period of time until you get to a point where it's no longer needed. And let's give a real-world example of that. Let's go back to the brick-and-mortar driver's license. I'm using the North American model here. We all, Canada, America, around the age of 16 or so, when you went to go get your driver's license, you provided a birth certificate. After you provided that birth certificate to the DMV, how many times in your life, past 16, have you ever had to present your birth certificate? You didn't have to, because through transitive trust in a paper-based model, the driver's license already had that information built in. So basically, the driver's license became a new version of the birth certificate. And by the way, the DMV was not the issuer of origin of a proof of birth, right? But because they did the KYC processing of that upfront, they now are able to be the trusted entity, the trusted attester of your birth date. And so this model, I think, will build in as we go forward. This should occur in digital as we move towards digital credentials for the issuance of all types of information. Let's not just get hung up on identity information, all types of information. So it could be your resume, it could be your loyalty cards and payments. There's lots of different forms of digital credentials that we can issue. The point is, who is the original, the issue of origination for the data, who originally vetted you, and then we need to come up with the right term. I don't know what the right term is. In this conversation, we'll probably talk about digital notaries, but some entity who's going to reissue an attestation about data that they vetted from the issuer of origin.
I think in the credential trust triangle that certain most of the listeners of this are quite familiar with, where it just describes the interactions, relationships, and exchange of data between different entities that act in the roles of issuers, holders, and verifiers. Is there a role missing in there? And I know you've written in the past about the role of the examiner. Is that the same role as the issuer? How does it tie into the whole trust triangle? And is the lack of description about the examiner possibly prohibiting from a lot of digitization or adoption of credentials?
Yeah. So what I've tried to inject in some of my earlier writings on this is that we have to recognize that we have to, again, coexist with brick and mortar. The processes that are there today, KYC processing is a regulated model, right? You have to do it for compliance, right? So there's rules for it today. We don't want to disrupt that. We want to leverage it. We want to augment it. And in that model today, I'll refer to the role or the persona as the examiner. There is some person or persons who, during KYC processing, who vets a set of credentials. So again, let's use the DMV with the driver's license. When you walk in at the DMV, you're carrying your original birth certificate. You hand it to the agent. Does the agent go and scan it? Yeah, they take a document of it, right? They copy it, just give it back to you. But they visually vet it, right? And by the way, that is opportunity for human error. Okay, during that KYC processing, it's very human-based vetting. The examiner is visually vetting the credential, and that's fine, right? And they have a certain set of steps during their KYC processing at the DMV to vet the credentials, the minimum set of credentials that they require to obtain a driver's license. All of the data they obtain is put into a system of record, and now that system of record about Matt becomes the attestations that the DMV can now issue in a driver's license. But once it's done once that physical examination is done once, then once we get to the digital model, all you're doing is you're building upon attestations from other issues, right? In one of the protocols I submitted to, or suggestions I submitted to Aries, was what if we were able to, like, in certain KYC processing, there's a notion that you have to have the examiner needs to have a copy of the original document. So, like I said, the DMV agent takes a copy, and they scan it and it goes into their database. Not only is the information there, but an image of your original document is in their database. So if they ever wanted to see where's the proof, right? The evidence that they actually took that. We could do that today in our digital credential model, right? So I talk about this notion of again, maybe the phrase digital notary is wrong, and I'm open to other suggestions. But any entity, let's call it, I use the example of the credit union, okay? Because credit unions have branch offices in the neighborhoods. If you look at the credit union, I can walk into the credit union and say, here's my birth certificate. Here's my utility bill. Here's my driver's license, okay? Please take these physical brick and mortar, paper plastic forms of identity, and please vet them, examine them as the credit union. They as a digital notary, they can say, yep, we vet them, we take copies, we'll put it into our system of record for you in your account. We'll manage that for you. By the way, we're going to charge you a fee, okay, for managing your forms of your original documents and being able to respond to anybody who wants copies to them. But in return, we're going to issue you attestations, digital credentials for the data that's in those. Now, it's up to the credit union. Maybe it's like a credit union credential, or maybe there's multiple credit union credentials, but it's not like the credit union driver's license, right? It's a digital credential of your government ID issued by the credit union as a digital notary. They're notarizing and attesting to the fact that they've performed this work, the examiner work. So the point there is the examination, that role should not have to be dependent on the agency of origination, right? You don't have to be, that physical examiner that happens once at the DMV should not have to be the only person who can vet that.
Notarization could be looked at as just a digitization story, right? And your example of the examiner in the credit union, that's happening through visual vetting. They're storing data. By the way, they store this data anyways, so it doesn't really change the process, but this is in the physical world. A lot of the digitization stories that have happened to date and continue to happen and big money in this industry is just literally turning paper copies or paper documents into digital versions. Like PDF documents or stuff like that, right? And if you even look at like e-signature vendors and stuff like that, like it's really that's the area that they play in. And so I think the step that they haven't taken yet, whether it's an examiner in the physical world or whether it's an examiner in the digital world, like I'm assuming an ID authentication company is kind of categorized as an examiner at the same time, right? They're creating some assurance on an ID that they're not necessarily checking against the source data, but they're doing some process that they could showcase there. So whether it's an examiner in the physical world or an examiner in the digital world, it's really then how do you move that towards extending it to machine readable credential type of things, right? And there's a path for both of those, and they're both different types of companies. Like the credit union is quite different to a document authentication company, but there's probably a similar path for both of them to extend their offerings.
Totally agree. Let's give two examples. So some of us in the industry today have taken existing verification services. I'm not going to name them, right? But there's verification services where I can actually make an API call. If I take my phone and take a picture of my driver's license, I can make an API call to some service, and they will vet it and come back and say, yes, it's been blessed, right? It's been verified. Okay. That couldn't we say, Matt, that backend verifier, that remote verifier is an examiner? It's a digital examiner, but they're doing the examination. Now let's go back to brick and mortar again. I used to work over in Arizona with the Department of Transportation there around driver's licenses, digital driver's licenses. And one of the things I learned there was that, as an example, it's not only there in Arizona, but Arizona has very remote regions. So when the citizen cannot really make it to a DMV office, to the DMV offices even though they have field offices, they don't have field offices in all these remote places. So what did the DMV do? They brought the examiners to the to the regions. They created a DMV agency truck. The trucks go out, right, to the remote areas, and then the people can come to the truck and get vetted through an examiner. The agent is moved. So this is my point of the digital notary, like using the example of the credit union, because the credit unions are in so many neighborhoods. It doesn't have to be a credit union. Any trusted entity, that's a whole discussion right there. But any trusted entity that can do the vetting, right, and provide a service, the examination service, and that examination service says they're going to examine, do the KYC processing that's required, capture and retain the evidence, being the images, to your point, of the original documents, okay, on your behalf. Now, the same principles that we've all talked about for decentralized identity around portability and so forth should still take place here, okay? But that digital notary, whether it's a credit union or some other entity, should be able to then issue digital credentials based on the information that they've verified and now can attest to in their system of record for you. At that point, if we can see the marketplace with that level of issuance of credentials, now verifiers sit back and they should be asking questions like, wait a second, all this money I'm spending on verification services, right? Is there an opportunity, a cost savings opportunity to leverage transit trust and start accepting digital credentials? Oh, and by the way, there's also a built-in customer satisfaction opportunity here, because using digital credentials, there's privacy aspects that we all talked about, there's conveniency aspects that we can talk about, and there's policy benefits. I can start requiring, just to log into my account, my website as a business, I can now start requiring more than just a password, right, and user ID. I can start requiring, from a policy standpoint, based on the individual's authentication needs, multiple different, I'll say, digital credentials. So I guess, what we're trying to get to, back to the chicken egg conversation, right, is how do we bootstrap the marketplace? Typically, we wait for government. And I don't think we should be waiting anymore, right? I think we should figure out a way to inject as a complement. Government's not going to go away. Government's still going to, some government agencies are going to be faster than others. But as a complement, there's a business opportunity, in my opinion. Startups, think about this. Who can actually provide digital notary services to help issue credentials?
I've always said that the business cases are always in the verifications, right? It's like there are business cases to be made for issuers. You mentioned an example, you just charged to issue a credential. So it's like, okay, you could add a new revenue stream for the examination service that you're conducting, but the real business value, the real volume will happen in the verifications that happen, right? How often do you get issued a driver's license versus how often you have to show your driver's license in different scenarios, right, in your day-to-day life? I guess, like you said, the government, they're going to play a role. They have that database of unique identifiers that is based on the process that they're running. But it really comes down at the end of the day to where the business value is, which is, if it's in the verification, then what policy makes sense, what risk policy makes sense for the verifier. And you don't necessarily need to have an ID issued by the government. And by the way, having a proof of address or having a proof of birth date or having certain of these elements could be sufficient in a lot of use cases where why does a verifier need to know that I have a valid driver's license, for example, that they're just using certain attributes within there?
Yeah, let's take that further. So one of the things right now is that in brick and mortar, the example of the driver's license, it has a proof of your address that can be trusted. But if there were multiple credentials that you had in your possession that had the same attestation or some attestations of around the same address value, right? Dan lives on 10 Main Street, and I have three issuers that have given me credentials in my wallet that say that. They're not on my driver's license, but I have 3 issues saying that. All of a sudden now the verifiers can say, wait a second, isn't it a stronger verification if I have attestations from multiple issuers as opposed to just one, regardless whether it's government or not? It's back to trust, right? And so our thinking about verification processing, verification policies, there's a whole opportunity here, just from a policy management standpoint for verifiers, to rethink how they're going to authenticate users and authorize users. I may authenticate you to the site because you've given me proof of membership, right? But maybe now I can require additional credentials to authorize you to certain of the privileges that you're seeking on my site. You know, I'm speaking in abstract. Going back to the monetary aspect, you know, as you said, the business of the verifiers is there. But again, if you're a verifier, you want to help bootstrap the industry, well, what do you need to do? You need to get credentials out there for verification. What could you do to seed the marketplace? You know, this is what I'm trying to get to. And over time, if we all agree that the verification is the long run for the monetary aspect of this, then it's okay if we just use a small window of opportunity to seed the marketplace, to issue credentials in a digital notary model until the government agencies, or better yet, the agencies, the issuers of origination, wake up and get into the game. But we shouldn't have to wait for that, is my point. And I really think, I actually think at some point that this notion that I call digital notary actually has a monetary value, because I may want to, as a citizen, be it where I bank or where I want to go to. It doesn't have to be a credit union or bank. It could be some other. It could be maybe my law firm, something I go to where they have my safe vault of all my physical paper-based credentials that I was issued. All right, and then that entity is then being the digital notary to issue me my digital credentials to get me on my road. Think about that. That now means that the issuance of credentials is an opportunity for a whole set of trusted service providers. It doesn't have to be a bank. It could be a law firm. It could be there's others, okay, that people trust in their personal lives to actually manage this for them.
And I mean, it could be it could be a technology company. If the technology company or the startup is making their examination process transparent and visible and showing what they're doing, if it meets the policies of certain verifiers, then it should be good enough, you would think.
It should be, right? But let's just say, and I'm not going to mention any, but some of those that support a federated identity model where it's like, use your social ID to go log in with two other sites. You know who I'm talking about. What have they done to vet you, really? You got a password and user ID. You get an email address or something. They haven't done much. Now, if they change that game, okay, sure.
Yeah, and I mean, you could replicate the vetting processes that happens in the DMV or that happens through whatever authentication methods, like the amount of OTPs that I'm receiving now on a daily basis is higher than it's ever been, and it's continuing to rise. So there's different things that you could do, and if you're making the process clear of what you're doing, you could help and establish enough trust. And you don't have to be an issuer of a driver's license because you're not the issuer of the driver's license, but you could issue credentials of a verified person or a verified human being or whatever that makes sense to the policy of the verifier.
There's been several startups that I had the opportunity to work with several years ago in the space. I won't mention them, but they all tapped into a similar pattern that I thought was very intelligent, which is, from a user experience standpoint, help the individual go through an understanding of what it means to go through the steps of NIST compliance, right? So what NIST level 1, 2, 3, so forth of their verification of their identity information. building that up, if you think about it, imagine having your wallet and you having a bunch of credentials in there, and you having, like, you can have a NIST score, right? You can have some sort of level of, I've achieved in my wallet a level of trustworthiness, right? That I can now present to any verifier that I want to share that I want to provide and consent, share my information. I don't have to write it all. But that itself becomes, that score itself becomes now it's not only an attestation, but it's another indicator for those who are doing verification. And that's a much different model we're dealing with in brick and mortar today, Matt. Right now, everybody's, as you said, we're just doing these very rote verifications of documents that have been proclaimed as required documents, okay? But is it really the documents, like going back, do we really need the document that has the driver's license number on it? Or is it what we're really interested in is who's attesting to the fact that I live on 10 Main Street? It's that data element, right? And it's a series of data elements, and it could be based on the requirements I require as a verifier. It could be data elements from multiple documents, right? This is people who've seen some of my writings, this has been one of my main beefs with ISO 18013 Part 5, better known as MDL, mobile driver's licenses. That is a protocol and a standard for a single data model, for a single set of a single a digital credential, all right? But most verification policies require more than one data model, one credential. And so you need to have a model where, in a protocol, where that supports the presentment of multiple credentials that can be verified to meet policies.
But I feel like that often happens when people are trying to create digital transformation around physical processes to digital processes, is they kind of just replicate the same thing in the physical world to a digital space, when in reality your policies in the physical world will maybe give you more flexibility to go through and do your thing. Whereas if you're limiting it in the digital space, you're kind of you could use different tools to achieve the same thing, right? You don't necessarily need to replicate the same thing in the digital space.
Yeah, I agree. I've had some of our folks from some of the bigger vendors in this space make this claim to me, Dan, it's just table stakes. We're just starting here. I'm like, my response is, so basically, you have no urgency. You're just going to take the industry and the public through a process that is convenient for you, right? When you know today we can go from, instead of going A, B, to C, we can go from A to C very quickly and have the right experience, right, out of the box. But that's not what's happening. And unfortunately, that's why, to me, this conversation will help to challenge that approach. If we could help bootstrap the marketplace with digital credentials, industry agnostic, schema agnostic credentials that can be used in all sorts of different use cases, then adoption will happen faster, and then all of a sudden being locked to one model, like one document schema, as a form of identity, it won't be as viable. It won't be as convenient for users. The use case of getting to the airport is fantastic, great. But what else? What else can you use it? Right? And there's so many other things on a daily basis that we use these credentials for today. We should be focusing on the bigger bang for the buck, right? There is a initiative that's starting off that will hopefully focus on combining some of these topics for interoperability, but it's still early days.
So then for me, the MDL is basically, it's the same topic that we were talking about earlier, that a lot of the digital transformation today has just been about taking paper-based things and copying it into a digital format when maybe that's not the right solution.
My challenge, Matt, for anybody who is a supporter of ISO 18013 Part 5 is walk up to any officer in any country and ask them how you would do a traffic stop in a digital model. A traffic stop requires not one, but minimally two, most often three forms of credential verification. Those credentials are issued by multiple issuers. A insurance company, the issue of a car registration, issue of driver's privileges, driver's license. You can't do it. So if you can't, if the protocol that we've spent over 10 years working on doesn't support that, why do we continue going down this path? I can tell you why, but I mean, I don't want to derail this conversation, but the root of that is that the folks that have been supporting that spec have all been supporters of the manufacturer of electronic readers. They don't want to get past that, right? That's a huge industry. Think about all the readers, from merchants to TSA to anywhere you swipe cards, right? Those readers are there.
I've been very curious about the topic of micro credentials recently, and I feel like it fits into this conversation as well. And some examples of this, like the DMV will issue you a driver's license. It's a driver's license schema. It'll have an attribute that has your address on it, but they're perhaps not the best possible issuer of an address. Like, for example, your municipality, who you pay municipality taxes to, they have a pretty good idea of, if you're a house owner, for example, of where you live, right? And so when you think about, hey, let's try to avoid just taking paper-based things and copying it to the digital world. First of all, it's not machine readable, but then there's privacy, not issues, but we could gain more privacy benefits by taking more of a micro-credentialing approach. So you don't necessarily have to issue a driver's license credential. If you have good assurance that a specific attribute is good, you should be able to issue that specific attribute. And I think that if you're able to do kind of more of this micro-credential approach that ties it more to the system of truth rather than these compounds, then you could do the compounds at the verification side of things, right? And that really creates I think it creates more assurance on things, but it also makes it easier to align with policies of verifiers, and it has tons of privacy benefits.
I agree. And so to me, that whole model is a game changer, because it literally blows the whole model up that we have today. Why? Because today you have everything is document based, tied to, like you said, a document with an identifier. But if we change the granularity, which is what it is, right? Right now, we're talking about data elements associated with a schema for a specific document. But if we change the granularity from verification to not be document-based, but to be attribute-based. So when I do the verification, send me 2 forms of your address. I don't care where they came from. Send me 2 forms of your address, as long as I can verify through transitive trust that those issuers were trusted, and I can verify all 3. And by the way, all 3 are in agreement. Dan lives on 10 Main Street. To your point, I don't go to the DMV and update my DMV record for probably 8 years. In some cases, especially now in 2022, people move a lot more than they don't stay in the same residences as much. So the driver's license really isn't the best source of truth for some data elements. So if we go back to if we change the granularity from document to attribute, right? Then all of a sudden now the issuers of those attributes can be much larger. The scope of issuers could be much larger. And then your policies, to your point, can be expanded to require more proof of issuers that are in agreement about a certain attribute.
What are some of the misconceptions that you hear about kind of using digital credentials for verification, or even becoming like a digital notary or an issuer. And I'll just throw one out there, is that one thing that I hear quite often is that people don't necessarily want to become digital notaries or issuers after doing an examination because they feel like there'll be liability downstream. I think that I would say that is false. I would like to hear your opinion on that, because I'm sure you hear that like I do. And then, are there any other misconceptions or just false statements that you hear on a recurring basis?
This hits dear to me, because I in the last role, I had a high-level executive who's very high level right now in my past company say to me, this is a non-starter because of liability. My response was, show me the risk. End the conversation. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to have the conversation. Okay. Let's go back to KYC processing is done every day. It's done in a lot of entities. If you want to get hired, you apply for a job, there's KYC processing being done on you. Okay. Is there risk when Dan applies to company A, gets hired by company A, leaves company A and goes to company B, and B asks for company A for a reference? Isn't that reference based on the attestations you had about Dan? Is there liability associated with that? Sure, but what's the risk? I don't understand. I honestly, let's go back to the agencies. Today, when the DMV issues the driver's license for Dan based on vetting the birth certificate that Dan got from another government agency, did the DMV now take over all of the liability that the agency of vital records had about the birth certificate? Not to my knowledge. The agency of vital records still has that. All that's being said by the DMV is that they've attested and examined, verified to the best of their ability, and kept a record of the fact that they've proofed Dan's birth certificate. Based on that, they can now make decisions about Dan and their relationship with Dan. In their system of record, they know that Dan was born on January 1st. Okay. Based on that, they can put that on their credential. Where's the liability now? Is at the end of the day, if some other entity, some other verifier wants to verify the driver's license or the digital driver's license or the digital credential that was issued by an agency, they're the ones who are doing the further on KYC. They're the ones who are taking on the risk. No one's saying that the original issuer says that you have to use this credential. Let's go a step further. The driver's license was created to give the privilege of driving. Nowhere at the beginning when these credentials were created, when ISO 1813 Part 1, that's the data model, was created, no one had an inkling about using this data model to get on a plane, right? But the credential has been used there. Now, does that mean that the TSA is going to hold liable the DMV for a credential being fraudulent? In paper, we all know there's paper credentials that for driver's licenses that are fraudulent today, right? Is the DMV going to be held liable for that? They didn't issue it. The one that's required to deal with I would say the risk, I don't want to say liability, but the risk is the verifier. Did the verifier, to the best of its ability, and do the due diligence required to vet the data that it is now going to trust? And that's why, unlike in brick and mortar, in the model we're talking about, and the point that you brought up about micro credentials, if the verifier requests as policy now multiple forms of address verification from multiple different entities, that means they're doing more due diligence in the digital model than they would be in the brick and mortar model.
Another misconception I think I see a lot, and just trying to think more from the verifiers or the organizations that would want to consume digital identity data, is around the whole topic of privacy, and specifically examples like data minimization. And there are misconceptions on the other side as well, where there's, I don't know, thousands of initiatives around kind of digitally transforming how KYC is done today. But I think people feel that with these decentralized solutions, they won't work because the verifiers won't be able to capture the data they need to capture. And for me, that's just a ridiculous comment you hear over and over again. It's just, at the end of the day, it comes down to consent, just like it comes down to consent today in interactions. And if there is legislative or just whatever policy reasons for data to be captured, it'll still be captured. It's just that you're able to be like purely in the driver's seat.
Yeah. I mean, look at where we're going in the wallet space, right? I think we're at a point now in the industry where people agree that, the model of, cloud-based wallets, agent-based wallets is forthcoming. Okay. And I always use the model, when we built this in my prior role, we built this into our product. I used to use the analogy that people are already used to cloud-based storage, whether it's for files, photos, videos, whatever, in a vault at some provider, a cloud provider, could be Dropbox, iCloud, whatever. Okay. We'll carry that forward to your digital wallet. Who do I trust to be the custodian of my digital credentials? Those things that it may be more than just digital credentials. Any digital instrument that I want to store in my digital wallet or vault, okay? And who's going to be the custodian of that vault? As long as, at least from Dan's perspective, I have the ability to say, I'm going to drop my account there and move my wallet to someplace else, right? To the provider. If we go down this path, now the notion of trust is not just on the KYC processing, because it's the storage of all your digital credentials, your digital assets. So it's not just, and I believe if we go down this path a little further, if there's going to be folks that are vendors who are going to say, we're going to be your wallet provider, why couldn't those same vendors say, well, we'll also be your digital notary to store the evidence of your original credentials that we'll vet, and then we'll issue you digital credentials and we'll store them in your wallet? You see, the opportunity is there. What my point is, there's so many different models that we can go down here to help bootstrap this marketplace without having to wait for the issues of origin to get into the game.
Can you maybe just elaborate on how the governance is going to get us there versus the tech?
I'm not sure if it's going to get us there. It's just that if we were to identify a set of entities to provide digital notary services that we talked about on this conversation, then there's going to have to be a level of a government's framework out there so that both the players in the ecosystem, the verifiers and the issuers, have an understanding of who are the trusted notaries, right? Not just any arbitrary player is going to be doing. They're going to have to, a notary is going to have to abide by certain, tasks. So again, back to brick and mortar, that truck that left the field office in Arizona to go to the rural is a representative of the DMV and is going to perform the same activities. It's not just some arbitrary, mom and pop going to do that. It is an agent of the DMV doing the examination. We need to have trusted agents that are performing these digital notarization services, and that so that the verifiers can accept it.
Yeah, and trusted services in quote being trusted because of the robustness of the governance model,
of the governance framework, not because they're the government. That's the difference, right? They're not the government, but they're members of an ecosystem adhering to a governance framework that's well understood and transparently made available.
Awesome. And any other points on the notary services we didn't touch on today, Dan, that you think we would want to put into this conversation?
I don't like typically, giving reference, pointing to stuff, but if our conversation hasn't been as well as is understood as we've tried to achieve, we can point to the RFC that I published several years ago around this notion of a digital notary for evidence. By no means does that model have to hold true, but the conversation in that RFC talks about this to give more example of how this can happen. And what I tried to achieve in that publication was to show that if physical document level evidence is still required as we transition from a paper-based KYC model to a digital KYC model, then this protocol, this evidence-based protocol, could be there as a bridge to get us there, so that any digital notary could still be a storer of your physical documents or images, proof of them, and then provide anybody who wants to do back-end requests for them in the future can get there. So, for example, the protocol says that if digital notary Acme issues Dan a credential, and Dan went to Acme to get to provide notarization services, Acme now has Dan's images of Dan's driver's license, birth certificate, whatever. They're storing it. I have a relationship with them. If Dan now goes to the bank and he uses his digital credential, and the bank says, well, we're going to accept this, but in our transition to digital KYC, we're going to still we're still going to request evidence of your original documents. Well, then this protocol says they can make a call based inside my digital credential I present to them. Is going to be a callback information to Acme where they can request copies of the documents on my consent. So the protocol is literally set up to be a bridge to get us to coexist between digital credentials and brick and mortar credentials and help to bootstrap the marketplace.
Which shows the importance of having consent and consent receipts as key features inside of wallets.
Exactly. But I also want to emphasize here, and I hope this is a message that comes out of this conversation, is that this topic of digital notarization and digital KYC and how to bootstrap the marketplace, that bootstrapping must assume coexistence. It's not going to go from A to B. We need to coexist two models, and we can't hold one model, hostage because not all the pieces are in place, which is typical for lots of emerging technology. But as far as I'm concerned, we're not emerging anymore, right? It's there. We now need the players to come to the table to start using it. And how do we help them along? And so that bootstrapping, I think the digital notary will help solve the chicken and egg problem.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.